welcome back to my channel for my top 10 favourite fantasy novels of all time, although I should say specifically adult fantasy novels. So the reason I am categorising them such is because last year I actually did a video all about my top 10 favourite young adult fantasy novels, and I feel like I covered those in that video pretty fully and well-roundedly, and if you're interested in those you can check them out there. Plus, it gives me more space to talk about all of the fantasy books I love so much and so dearly, as well as allowing those of you who prefer young adult or adult to go to the video you're most interested in. Although I will say all 20 books that cover both videos are favourites. I love them all as a reader of both the young adult and adult fiction, and I think if you read young adult there's something for you in this adult video, and if you read adult there's something for you in the young adult video. So yeah, maybe check them both out, I don't know. But with that being said, let's just jump straight in and talk about my top 10 favourite fantasy novels of all time. They're aimed at adults. Yeah, I think that's covered it. Let's start with my mass market paperbacks because I love me a fantasy mass market. The first one is probably going to come as no surprise to you. I mean, a few of these may come as no surprise to you if you've watched a lot of my videos, some of them may, and that is Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. So I would like wholeheartedly list Terry Pratchett and his entire Discworld series as one of my favourite fantasy authors and favourite fantasy series, but if I were to pick one book, which I wanted to do for this video, it has to be Going Postal. This is a book I come back to time and time again, and I also think it's somewhere that you can just jump straight into the Discworld with, so it feels like a recommendation that works both as my favourite and as one that you can go and read even if you haven't read any Discworld before. So for some context, Terry Pratchett's Discworld is a world, a fantasy world that he created, which is a planet shaped like a disc that rides through space on the back of 4 elephants on the back of a giant turtle, and he has set around 40 books on that planet. Now of course there is a chronological order in terms of the date these books came out in, but it is not necessary to read these books in chronological order of them coming out, because within the Discworld series as a whole there are minor series that follow specific characters. So this for example is the first in a series of books within Discworld that follows our character Moist von Lipwig. So he is the protagonist of this series, and I'm going to talk more about him and this story now specifically. It is all about Moist, who is an ex-conman, or should we just say current conman, who has been imprisoned and convicted and sentenced to hang. But he is quite literally hung within an inch of his life, so he does not actually die. Instead, he is taken to the patrician's offices, who is in charge of Ankh-Morpork, the capital of the Discworld, and given an opportunity. He has a choice. Basically, he can follow through with the execution, he can be executed for his crimes, or he can become Postmaster General. The post office in the Discworld has gone into disrepair. It needs a loving hand or a savvy business hand to bring it back from the dust, and Moist is the man that has been appointed for whatever reason. He of course sees this as an opportunity for him to escape and go on the run and take on a new identity. So he says, yes, I'll do it, of course I'll go on the straight and narrow and become the Postmaster General, but always with plans of escaping. Things aren't as easy as he hoped for, however. He has a giant stone golem guarding him, he has a lot of responsibilities, and actually it turns out a bunch of dangers to face up to with the post office, because not everybody wants the post office to open back up. And this series is hilarious. In books 2 and 3 we follow Moist's involvement in other institutions in Ankh-Morpork, but I particularly love his role as Postmaster General. I love this book in particular. I have reread this countless times. It's one of my go-to comfort reads. It's so funny, it's so witty, it's so clever, the characters are so endearing, they are morally grey but lovable, and I just cannot get enough of the Discworld or this book in particular. Then my next mass market paperback is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. This is a book I've talked a lot about in the past. It's historical fantasy set in medieval Ireland, and it's the first in a 6-book series called the Seven Waters series. And throughout the Seven Waters series you follow a different member of the Seven Waters family in each book. So one thing I will say for this book that is that although it's the first in a series, you could read it as a standalone. It very much encompasses and covers its own entire narrative, and the protagonist in this book is not the protagonist in the later books. So if you're looking for more of like a chunky historical standalone fantasy and aren't sure if you want to commit to a series, although I think you might if you read this book, then this is one to check out. It's about a young woman named Sorcha who is the 7th child of the 7th son, but unlike her brothers, is a girl. Her father and her don't have a particularly attentive relationship. She has lived her life incredibly close with her brothers, exploring the Irish landscape that they live within. Her father is a lord and runs a lot of this land, but she's never had a mother because she died either in childbirth or early on in her life. And now as a teenager, her father has remarried a woman who turns out to be a sorceress, and she does not like this woman because she seems like she has some rather, you know, malicious intent, some nefarious motives, and she and her brothers have mixed reactions to her. Some of them love their new stepmother, maybe a little bit too much. Some of them hate her. But it all comes to a head when the stepmother curses her brothers. And this is actually a take on the fairy tale of the Six Swan Brothers. But despite this, it feels very much like its own unique narrative. It is a loose fairy tale retelling, but it doesn't necessarily feel like you're reading a fairy tale retelling. And I guess it's also a slightly less well-known fairy tale, but still, it feels very much like its own invention. And then carrying on, each book in the series is its own story. They are no longer fairy tale retellings. But this book is truly stunning. It is so intricately woven. It is so beautifully written. It is very slow paced, and there is a very, very slow paced romance that's introduced during the story. This is considered a fantasy romance novel, but more than anything for me, it feels like the story of a young woman trying to save her brother, her perseverance, her dedication, her strength, but not necessarily in the traditional sense of fantasy novels where you get a lot of sword fighting and that kind of strength. It's a very different kind of strength. I will note, however, before you read this, that there is a scene of sexual assault in this book, and I know a lot of you prefer to know that going into the book. I myself very much appreciate if I am pre-warned about that. But I will say, of all the books I have read that feature sexual assault, particularly in the fantasy genre, this handles it the best. It explores the trauma that the character experiences because of that sexual assault, and it feels very honest and raw. And I just adore everything about this book and Juliette Marillier's writing as a whole. Next up, let's move on to a subgenre of fantasy that you all know I love, and that is dragon fantasy. I cannot get enough dragon fantasy, and there are a few dragon books in my YA video as well, but my top two tier adult ones are these right here. First up is a standalone, and as you may have gathered from my discussion of Daughter of the Forest, standalones are a little bit rare in the fantasy genre. They definitely aren't as common as big, long, winding series. I myself recently published my first fantasy novel for adults, which does heavily feature dragons, and I confess it is the first in a series. I have fallen into that trope. It cannot be helped, but sometimes a standalone is what you need. And this book is like nothing else I've ever read before. This is a book which is almost entirely made up of characters who are dragons. So there maybe are some references to humans, but it's kind of irrelevant to the society and the storyline. Because this is a world where dragons exist alone, where dragons found cities, where dragons live in manor houses, where dragons have politics between themselves, and where dragons take part in arranged marriages and churches, and it very much resembles a Jane Austen novel or an Anthony Trollope novel, but with dragons, which is so incredibly niche, but works so incredibly well. Like, that could have gone wrong, but it doesn't. Jo Walton nailed this concept, and it was a concept I never knew I needed, but I'm so glad exists. I actually wish this was in a series. I would love more books like this, even if they were about different characters, but for now, this will have to do. Like I mentioned, it's a little bit like a Jane Austen or an Anthony Trollope. It feels like it's set in the 1800s, although it's not specified in that sense. It feels like we are in Regency era England, but that is not specified. And we are following a group of dragon siblings whose father has passed away and left them in a bit of an inheritance kerfuffle, and they need to sort through it. There are marriage arrangements, forbidden loves, political machinations, family feuds, but it all feels realistic to the dragons. Like, Jo Walton has taken a concept that feels very historical, and she hasn't just flung dragons into that and made it feel awkward. The dragons still do things according to the way that perhaps a gigantic fire-breathing beast with claws would do. And it works. It really, really works. My next dragon book is the first in a series, however. This is book one in a series of 4 books called The Rainwild Chronicles. And The Rainwild Chronicles is another one which is a series within a series. So The Rainwild Chronicles is a series which is part of Robin Hobb's realm of the Elderlings books. So Robin Hobb has written a number of series which are all set in the same universe and come under the umbrella of the realm of the Elderlings. Technically, chronologically, I believe this is maybe like the third series, something along those lines. It's certainly not the first, but it follows central characters who are not central to the earlier books, but if you read this before the other books, you may get slight spoilers for the world building and the progression of time. I, however, couldn't care less about that kind of thing. I wanted to read this series and I'm so glad that I did. But I always just feel like if you're more likely to read this series than sort of slog your way through series you're less interested in, then why does it matter if you've given yourself small world spoilers? Because otherwise you might just read none of them. I don't know. Controversial perhaps. The story itself, however, is about a group of dragons and a group of dragon keepers. So the first young dragons to have been born really in this world for centuries have come, but they are weak and they are not the dragons of old that people expect them to be. So the people of the Rainwells have decided that they don't want them. They want rid of them and they decide to send them to find a new home somewhere further upriver with the help of these dragon keepers, who are also people that are not very popular, who aren't really liked, who are shunned from society. And really the aim of the Rainwells is just to like be done with all of them. But they end up bonding, they end up on this adventure together. There are relationships and drama between the keepers, between the sailors in charge of the boats which are taking them down the river, between the dragons, and then there's also this really fantastic like lady biologist scientist who's fascinated by dragons that decides to join them on their trip because she wants to learn more about them. It's fantastic, it's multiple perspective, I love all the characters. These are some of my favourite dragons in fiction, and yeah, I'm really glad that I read this series, even if it isn't technically the first one in the realm of the Elderlings. My next book is solidly within the subgenre of fantasy romance, and it is actually possibly my favourite romance novel of all time, like #1 top tier, as well as being one of my favourite fantasy novels. That is Radiance by Grace Draven. And that is Radiance by Grace Draven. This book is incredible. It's about an arranged marriage between a human woman who is related to the king, but she's not like a princess, she's just a noblewoman, and the prince of the Kai people. So the Kai are a magical race which resemble humans in some ways, but also really don't resemble humans in other ways. For one, they are pretty much nocturnal, they really struggle to see in the daylight, so when Ildiko marries Brishan, she does have to adapt to a slightly new time routine. But what I love about this book is that although it's a arranged marriage where they didn't necessarily pick one another, they go into it with the best of intentions, and both are really, really good people. Both are very good people with a lot of respect for the other person, and they both understand that they are doing something to bring their people together. They always knew that this might happen because they are from noble and royal families, and they're very willing to go into it and just hoping that the other person is as willing to strike up a partnership with them as they are. And I mean just a friendship partnership and a running of a household partnership rather than a romantic one. Neither is attracted to the other at first. They are kind of repulsed by one another, both ways there. And it's a romance that takes its time. It's a romance that begins as two people who are flung together and try to adapt to their new situation. It's a romance about two people who really grow to care about one another, who become friends, who learn that they actually have a lot in common, who treat each other with respect. They have the least toxic relationship I have ever read in a romance book in my life, and one that naturally evolves into a romantic relationship, and I love it. It is my favourite romance I've ever read. It's the least toxic one I've ever read, and I've reread this book and find so much comfort in it whenever I need a little pick-me-up, so would highly recommend. Whilst we're on the topic of fantasy romance, I will recommend you my next favourite, and that is The Faceless Women by Emma Hamm. So technically this is another one which is book 4 in a series, but let me contextualise that for you. So this is Emma Hamm's Otherworld series where she retells fairy tales, and again there are sort of series within this series and some standalone novels. So books 1 and 2 are about the same characters and take on the narrative of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. Book 3 is a standalone Little Mermaid retelling, and then books 4 and 5, which are the ones I'm mentioning here, are a retelling of the Swan Princess. Now, I actually adore books 1 and 2, the Beauty and the Beast retelling as well, which start with the Heart of the Fae. But since this is a video about my absolute favourite fantasy novels, The Faceless Woman is my favourite. Her retelling of the Swan Princess and the narrative of books 4 and 5 in this series, or 1 and 2 in the Swan Princess series, are spectacular, and I love the characters above all else. I do think you could read them by themselves, but given that I do also love The Heart of the Fae, I would suggest maybe reading those as well. I definitely don't think you need to have read them, but they're fantastic and I would still recommend reading them. The Little Mermaid fairy tale, on the other hand, doesn't really feed in anything to the other ones, so that's just like completely optional and up to you. The Faceless Woman, however, does feature some very, very, very minor side characters from books 1 and 2. But I think I can tell you what the story is about without spoiling anything quite easily. So we have Aisling, a young witch who has the strangest curse upon her, in that nobody can see her face. So nobody is able to recognise her face or distinguish who she is from one person to another. She lives in a town where she supplies sort of witchy substances and potions when needed, but also people mistrust her and don't really like her. And this comes to a head at the beginning of the novel when they decide that she's bringing them bad luck and they're going to execute her. They're done with that, burn the witch. However, a member of the Unseelie court just happens to be passing at this time named Bran. So this is a fairy man of, like I mentioned, the Unseelie court who is part crow. And he decides to watch the proceedings and is spotted by Aisling, who ends up using her magic to put a curse on him so that if she dies, he dies. So he's basically forced to rescue her. She doesn't know how to break this curse, however, so the only way for them to be separated and for their lives to become independent once more is for them to go into the realm of the Fae and seek out a way to break this curse. But naturally, despite their antagonistic beginnings and the barbs and sassy quips that they exchange throughout the novel, they fall in love, and I love their dynamic. It is really fun. Like I said, there's definitely some antagonism there, but it never feels toxic. It feels fun and bantery, and I really like their exchanges. So following them on their adventure through the world of the Fae was so much fun. I loved in particular getting to see the Unseelie court, which is where the sort of more dark side of the Fae are supposed to live. My next fantastical subgenre for this video is in fact fantasy horror. Yes, so if you're not interested in horror, the next 2 books are horror, but then I have 2 more books to talk about at the end. So first up, we have The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. I had to include a T. Kingfisher book in here in general, and I struggled to pick which one I was going to include because I love her fairy tale retellings as well. But this is particularly unique and different from what else is in this video, so I felt like it was worth focusing in on. It is, like I mentioned, a fantasy horror novel about a young woman whose grandmother has recently died, and she's the only person at the moment who is able to go and clear out her house so that they can sell it. So she heads down to this sort of abandoned house with her pet dog to clear out her grandmother's home, only to discover that her grandmother was literally a hoarder and nobody had realised. Basically, the worst of her hoarding was on the 2nd floor, and no one had really gone into the 2nd floor of this house for a long time. She wasn't on great terms with her family. She was a pretty mean old woman. She was the very quintessential of the mean old woman who was pretty cruel and unkind. And there's not much love lost between her and her granddaughter, but this is her responsibility. Her father's not very well, so somebody has to do it, and she decides to take on that job. But when she is digging through all of this stuff, she ends up finding this strange notebook which turns out to have belonged to her grandfather. And inside this notebook are these really incomprehensible notes about strange creatures in the wood that her grandfather is obsessed with and convinced are real and absolutely terrified of. And this leads her down a dark and disturbing path when she starts to hear some noises in the woods herself. I'll say no more because you want the jumps and surprises of a horror novel, and this is definitely one of those twisty turny ones where you do find yourself on edge and jumping in your seat if you're that kind of person, and unable to quite like put out your mind when you're not reading it because you're thinking, what is going on? What on earth is in these woods? It really creeps inside your brain, and I think that's what you want from a horror narrative, and it is more of a fantastical horror, which I really enjoy. So rather than it being about, you know, serial killers and mass murderers, it has that sort of paranormal fantastical edge, and it's fun to follow along with that. We then have a horror fantasy which is also a alternative history novel set in the early 1900s, and that is Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. So this book is an alternative history of America in the early 1900s, so post-slavery era but still in the time of like Jim Crow and segregation. And it's around the time in which Birth of a Nation became very popular. Birth of a Nation started off as a novel and then was adapted into film a little while later, and it's an incredibly racist piece of propaganda that was focused on the Ku Klux Klan. But in this world in particular, we discover that the Ku Klux Klan are actually a group of otherworld beings possessing humans in order to fulfill their bloodlust, and they are infecting humanity through the film The Birth of a Nation. So it is in large part an analogy for the spread of racism and the infection of the Ku Klux Klan into society in America and how that affected the lives of black people in America, but with this fantastical twist. And it never feels like it's taking away from the reality of what actually happened. In fact, it feels very much like it's highlighting the horror of it in a new and different way, and it is so compelling. I loved our protagonist, who is someone that hunts down these monsters, and it was just incredibly imaginative and well written. Generally speaking, I'm a big fan of this author, and this is my favourite of their work. Like I mentioned, however, there are 2 more books, and these are definitely not horror. The first of which is very much what I feel is traditional fantasy. It feels very much in the vein of traditional fantasy, and that is Alphabet of Thorn by Patricia A. McKillip. So when I think of like quintessential traditional fantasy, for me this is what I picture. This kind of cover, this kind of story, this kind of writing, and Patricia A. McKillip does some of the best in my opinion. This is my favourite of the books I've read by her, and it's another standalone, so that's awesome if that's what you are in the mood for. It's about a fantasy world, you know, with those medieval-esque vibes. It's a kingdom which has more recently become a queendom when our young princess is promoted after the passing of her father much earlier than she ever expected to be, and she isn't really prepared for this role. So we have our young inexperienced new queen. We also have a much older woman who is the sort of court sorceress or court witch. She is the magical practitioner that has been an aide and an advisor to the throne for many decades now, including this young woman's father. We then have an orphan woman who was raised by librarians and is now a translator, and she has a real way with languages, and one of her jobs is to look through new texts that have been discovered and try to find ways to translate texts that they've never translated before, including languages they've never translated before. And that is something that she's faced with at the beginning of this novel when she's handed a book that nobody can decipher except perhaps for her. Then lastly, we have a young man or a young wizard who is training up at the academy to perform magic and ends up meeting our translator. He actually is the person that ends up giving her the book, so their lives become intertwined in that sense. So you've got this multiple perspective novel about a group of very different characters who are all brought together in part by this book and what it means for their land. It's so beautiful. Like, the imagery in this book is so stunning, and it's such a creative fantasy world that you don't necessarily predict any of the twists and turns it's going to take. It also has a very soft, subtle romance between 2 of the characters, and I love that it features some older women in central roles to the storyline as well. Then last but not least, of course, I had to include a myth retelling, but particularly one that felt quite fantastical, and that was Circe by Madeline Miller. Of all the myth retellings I've read, this is the one that feels most firmly fantasy for me, although I guess it's also potentially like literary fiction. It's a myth retelling, it's lots of different things, but it is about the goddess of witchcraft, or one of the goddesses of witchcraft in ancient Greek mythology, so there's tons of magic, both in the sense of the divine and the witchy. Circe is the Titan goddess daughter of Helios, Titan god of the sun, and she is banished by the rest of the gods from Olympus to an island called Aea, where she has to live entirely by herself apart from the animals around her because she does something pretty bad at the beginning of this story, and nobody wants her around. But she's immortal. She lives for centuries, for millennia, and she sees the passing of so much time and so many mythological heroes who she meets that land on her island, who she ends up encountering when she is taken off the island for short periods, and her story interweaves so intricately with so many recognisable myths, and I love that about it. But I love that this book takes it from her perspective, because she's this character that crops up time and time again in mythology. But do we get her dedicated narrative? No. Do we get her perspective? No. So this book tries to imagine that, and it felt so real. It felt so honest. It felt so raw and so believable. And it's so evident that Madeline Miller knows a lot about mythology. She has a background in classics, and that very much comes across here, but she also adds a lot of character and a lot of empathy to the story as an author, which I adore. Those, however, are my top 10 favourite adult fantasy novels. Like I said, if you'd like to check out my top 10 favourite YA fantasy novels, I'll have that linked in the description box down below. I'll also have my own novel linked in the description box below in case you're interested in some more like Celtic, sapphic, dragon fantasy in your life, as well as everything else I've mentioned in this video. Let me know what your favourite fantasy novels are, because I'm always on the hunt for more. And until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!